Welcome to the Culture Creators series. My name is Hiam Sakakini, CEO of The Culture Equation. This series is for anybody who cares about workplace culture, catering for fast-growing startups and scale-ups. Welcome, Yaniv. I'm so excited to have you on the show or on this series, honestly, because you have been through it all, right? You've been through culture that was kind of designed for you. You've been through culture that you've co-designed with other leaders within a big, leadership team, for example, in Airtasker. And now you're going through the process of designing culture from scratch for an early stage startup, your own startups.
My name's Yaniv. I am founder and chief operating officer at a company called Circular. Circular is a circular economy company that has the mission to accelerate the adoption of the circular economy and reduce waste and change people's relationships to the objects in their lives. That's obviously a long-term piece of work that we imagine being the work of decades. The way we've decided to start is by offering flexible, sustainable, affordable subscriptions to consumer electronics. We're spread across Singapore and Australia. We are now live in both of those countries. So if you're keen to rent some new consumer electronics, feel free to check us out. I'm also the co-host of a podcast called the Startup Podcast, where my co-host and I try to share really actionable insights about building, running, working within a startup, and we try to publish a new episode every week. And finally, I have a newsletter called People Engineering, which really focuses in more on the organizational design and cultural side of things. Prior to my time at Circular, I started my career actually with a long stint at Google as a software engineer. So I have a background as a computer scientist. Grew up in Melbourne, studied in Melbourne, ended up in the Zurich office at Google as a software engineer and engineering manager. And I was actually 10 years at Google. It was a really great experience. Now we're going to dive into this a bit more. A place with a very strong culture. It was great to see how things are done at one of the world's really great companies. After that, I moved into executive roles at a couple of scale-ups here in Sydney. First, Flair HR, where I was VP of Engineering, and then Airtasker, where I was VP of Engineering, and then Chief Operating Officer. And I think it's probably worth just briefly touching on that transition because it's really at the core of how I think of things. I was VP of Engineering for 2 years, and I spent a lot of that time taking a team of about 50 people through a journey of culture and also process technology to get things to a level where we could really be a well-executing, high-performing engineering team. And obviously, that's something that I did with many other people. And after a while, I saw that the ultimate key to company success is how the different functions work together, how engineering works with product, works with marketing, works with customer support, and then works together with a unifying culture for the whole company. And so I made this transition to Chief Operating Officer, which was really about that. It was about how do we create a single high-performing organism that isn't broken down by department or by silo. And so when I left Airtasker, I was really passionate about taking that opportunity from the very beginning of a company's life cycle and seeing how much of the culture and principles I could help embed from the beginning and create a really high-performing company and high-performing organization with the sort of culture that I personally have always wanted to work at. And so that's what I've been doing at Circular. So far, it's been a lot of fun. And I guess that brings things up to date.
Well, that's a really nice way of, the transition from a culture that's already built for you, that you've plugged into, to a culture that you have almost redesigned as the company's grown, and then a culture now that you're creating from scratch. So we're going to dive into those different things. But before we do, what do you think of when you think of the word culture? Just so we can all get on the same page as how you define that word or think about it.
Yeah. So I was very influenced by a book by Ben Horowitz called What You Do Is Who You Are. And in a sense, It's a fantastic book because it talks about culture in a corporate setting using this very unusual set of examples, from the Haitian slave revolt to the Code of the Samurai to prison gangs and all sorts of things like that. But in a sense, the title gives it away, right? What you do is who you are. And a culture is really a set of attributes. It's a phenomenon that applies to a group of people that governs how they behave and how they act towards each other and as a group. And for me, culture is really fascinating because it has this sort of self-perpetuating property, and it has a sort of immune system where it's quite hard to change a culture. And that's both a strength and a weakness, because if your culture is good, it is a real strength. But if it is poor, it becomes a massive liability that is very hard to change. But fundamentally, yes, culture is this collective sense of what we care about and how we do things here. And so when I actually brought that into Circular, lots of companies have their set of company values, which are well-intentioned, but often don't get used very much. But one of the ideas I got from this book, What You Do Is Who You Are, is the samurai have the concept of virtues. And if a value is something you care about, a virtue is a concrete behavior that is aligned with those values. And that's considered a virtuous behavior. And so at Circular, we created a set of values, but at the same time, we attached to each value a number of virtues, which are much more concrete behaviors. And we say, our culture is embedding these behaviors into how we interact every day.
You know, that's something that you're right, because that step sometimes gets missed, and we end up with these beautifully designed values. Sometimes they're a little bit laden with buzzwords, but still beautifully designed, well-intentioned. People really want them to come to life, but without the virtues, they can be misinterpreted, or they can be sometimes used as weapons, depending on how people see them. So have you got, any examples of how you've sort of embedded these into a team, for example, where you've noticed behaviors on either side, well-intentioned, but maybe used in the wrong way?
Yeah, I mean, there's no magic formula. What I find is if you want to embed behaviors and values into a culture, you need to, first of all, incentivize the right behaviors, but also just talk about them a lot more than you're comfortable doing, which is a fairly general leadership principle, is repeat yourself a lot. I think the one of the big problems that companies have when they go through this exercise of coming up with the values and they get them printed on a poster and they stick the poster on the wall is that is the last time they ever get talked about. And, they just fade into the background. So what I try to do is to repeatedly mention our values and our virtues when there is a concrete situation where they're applicable. I say, remember, this is one of our virtues. How are we acting in a way that's in accordance with that virtue? So, for example, one of our values, just to be concrete, is waste less. We don't believe in wasting our planet's resources. We also don't believe in wasting time. We don't believe in wasting money. Okay, so what does that mean? One of our virtues that is associated with that value is take responsibility for always working on the most important thing. So in other words, it is your responsibility. The behavior that we are encouraging is taking accountability for how you spend your own time and not wasting it. So if you're in a meeting and you feel that you shouldn't be in that meeting, we are encouraging you to say, I actually think I don't need to be in this meeting. I'd rather work on something that is more impactful to the company. So I use those examples, and just as I'm saying them here, I bring these up at our company all hands meetings in a context where I notice that some people may not need to be in a meeting. I ask them, do they need to be there? And so really it is about operationalizing it. And once the culture is embedded sufficiently, the magic of it is then it becomes self-perpetuating, because humans are very good at acculturating themselves. If you join an organization with a strong culture, then you will quite quickly assume those cultural characteristics, those behaviors that typify the culture. So it really is about why, I was telling you my journey. Why am I joining at the beginning? Because that is by far the easiest time to embed culture. And in a sense, the only time when you can fully shape culture is when you have a little bit of a blank slate. It's never truly blank because people come in with their experiences, but you can start with a small group of people and get them behaving and thinking in a certain way. And then as the organization grows, as people join, they will adjust to those norms, to those values, to those virtues that are embodied by the culture.
I agree. And you're right, it is by far the easiest time. So when things move beyond 10 people to 100 people to 1,000 people to 10,000 people, like when you join Google, what are the structures that you think have to be in place in order for that self-perpetuation to continue? Because there's only so much you can learn from, let's say, being in a room with those founders or those, the leadership team that designed and kind of came up with and can so clearly articulate the virtues behind each and every one of the values. At some point, it gets bigger. You open up offices outside of the, that kind of founding location. You might put in place a local, I guess, general manager, MD in that location. They then have their own ideas around culture that they might want to create locally. So what are the structures you think have to be in place if this is going to continue scaling?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I think that there's a glib answer where I think back to my time at Google. In a sense, I talk about a culture being self-perpetuating. If you've done a good enough job and the culture is strong enough, there isn't that much that you need to do explicitly to perpetuate the culture. When I joined my engineering team at Google, it was very clear what was valued, what sort of behaviors were expected. And the point of a culture that is strong is it is enforced by peers. Managers do not need to enforce the culture. They do not need to say, this is the behavior, because the teams will be self-correcting and say, hey, no, that's not how we do it here. That's a phrase you want to listen out for. That's not how we do it here, or this is how we do it here. And if you get there, then that's very powerful. But what you mentioned is, I think when you have a culture that's powerful enough, it's less about taking proactive steps to perpetuate it and more about taking steps to defend it from degradation. And I think probably the biggest one that you kind of touched on is hiring, especially hiring senior leadership, where it is really important to hire leaders who align with the culture. Because the other thing about cultures is that they're not static. You can have a strong culture and you can have continuity in your culture, but it will always evolve. And every person has a little bit of influence to evolve the culture. But the more senior you are, the more influence you have. And so if you bring in a senior leader who is misaligned with the culture, then that has a toxic, corrosive effect on the culture. And so I really think, yes, it is about onboarding people well as a small piece, especially senior leaders, but it's actually about making sure that culture is a real consideration in the hiring process so that we only bring people on board who will perpetuate and reinforce and thrive in the culture that we have and that we want to continue.
That's such a good point. Now, how do you test for that in the interview process?
I won't say I have all the answers on this one. I think a lot of it is about simply being mindful. It can be so easy to simply neglect culture. You look at a person's CV, you look at their skills, you look at what they can bring to the company, and you don't think to ask them questions that might reflect on culture. So at Circular, we have an explicit culture fit interview or culture ad. I think culture fit is sometimes seen as non-inclusive, and I think there's merit to that statement. But the point here is to ask questions that see if the person can both fit into the existing culture and improve the existing culture in ways that you value, and in particular don't go against that culture. And so what we've used, and like I said, I won't hold this up as the best way, and we're always optimizing how we do this. We're having a discussion about it next week, but we've been using a set of structured behavioral interviews questions, which is really about saying, tell me about a time when you had to deal with conflict. Tell me about a time when you felt your manager or your leader was acting unethically, things like that. And then through having that discussion and seeing how people reacted to those scenarios in the past and what lens they had on those things, you can learn a lot from doing that.
Yeah, so good. It's an interesting one, and one where you're right. If you can, or if you end up letting somebody into that ecosystem that you have so well designed, and it is self-perpetuating, and for some reason you didn't catch those things, I often noticed that immune system starts to kick in pretty quickly anyway. And it's just being open to the noises that the system makes when there is that when there is that sort of organism in there that for some reason is not working with the rest of the culture of the organization.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is if you're bringing in people at lower levels in the company, the immune system can kick in and can effectively, it'll reject those people. They'll either conform or they'll eventually move on. I think the real danger is executive hiring, to be honest. That's where I've seen it go wrong, because if you bring in someone in a very influential position who doesn't match your culture, they can overwhelm the immune system because of the power they bring to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where you hear those words toxic come in. Narcissistic personalities or things like that sort of surface. And unfortunately, in today's world, that's like hyper, I guess, transparent. That's the sorts of things that just mark your reputation pretty quickly as an organization.
Indeed.
So given that experience, share some advice for our audience. We could have founders, first-time leaders who are now founders, now have that, I suppose, responsibility, huge responsibility on their shoulders. And they might not have the experience you've had of being part of a team, then leading teams, then leading an organization, and then, building their own organization from scratch. So what's the kinds of advice you would say, like my top 2-3 things you would give them?
So, well, my first bit of advice is that the soft stuff is harder than the hard stuff. And what I mean by that is, the sort of the skills and attributes that are often called soft skills, that are around communication, around culture, around people's happiness, and things like that. Getting them right is as difficult or more difficult. It's certainly rarer than getting the fundamentals of the business right, the stuff in the spreadsheets and the technology and so on. And so while it is the task of every early startup to survive, whatever time and attention you have to invest in your culture, start sooner than you think you need to, because you are setting a ball in motion down a hill here, and it will be much harder to catch it later on. So small moves at the beginning can have a huge outsized impact. So I really would say my advice is it's really about attention. As a founder, I think it can be easy to think this is not today's problem. Today's problem is to close a deal with a customer. Today's problem is to ship the product. But if you do not consider this as being within the realm of what's important for you now, you will reach a stage, and I've seen this so often, where you have got a successful business that has reached a certain level of scale and is basically hindered from meeting its full potential by having a weak or suboptimal culture. And then the repair work that needs to be done on that culture it's expensive, but worse than that, it's slow and it's time consuming. And it's still the right thing to do, of course. But if you can avoid some of that, then you will be in such a strong position. And the side effects are incredible too, because if you have a strong culture, you will start to be known for having a strong culture. You will be able to attract the best talent. You will get more value out of the talent that you have. And so there are so many benefits. And it doesn't sound concrete, but it really is, in a sense, concrete advice here, which is simply make sure that when you are looking at your priorities as a leader, that this is sitting there within the top few priorities and not just languishing as something that is tomorrow's problem.
That's such sage advice. You start earlier than you need to, and don't wait for that ball to be halfway down the hill. It is really hard to stop. That's brilliant. I mean, the last thing I'd love to ask you is, when you nerd out on this topic, you mentioned one book. I nerd out on your podcast, and I know that you do touch on the topic of culture and building teams. What else do you listen to? Where else do you find inspiration when you're thinking about these things?
Yeah, so I listen to a lot of audiobooks. Basically, I read hard copy stuff for pleasure. That's mostly fiction. And then most of my nonfiction I consume is audiobooks. And some of the books on culture that I really like. So I mentioned What You Do Is Who You Are.
Yes.
Another one that I really like is Five Dysfunctions of a Team, or The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. And there's a companion book called The Advantage. And I would consider him kind of the culture expert in terms of what are the really important fundamental things about what makes a team excellent. I also like, on culture, I like Turn the Ship Around, which is actually from a naval commander. And, I think there's a lot that companies can learn from the modern military, which is actually very different from how the military used to operate, in terms of teams that can operate effectively under a lot of strain and a lot of uncertainty. And then there's sort of two companies that I really look up to, and therefore I kind of recommend books written by and about them. So the first is Netflix. I think have a really interesting thought on the sort of people culture. You may not agree with everything they do, but they certainly have put a lot of thought and intention into how they do that. And so there are two books. They cover similar ground. If you really like it, read both of them. Otherwise, you can read one or the other. The first is called Powerful by Patty McCord, and she was the head of people and culture at Netflix for a long time. And then a more recent book is called No Rules Rules, and that's by Reed Hastings, who is the current co-CEO of Netflix. Both of them talk about their really interesting and somewhat unusual culture. And I think they've taken a lot of things to extremes based on really clear principles, which I think is exciting and refreshing for me. Mm-hmm. And then the other organization that I look up to in terms of the more operational side of their culture, sort of like the how we do things, is mm-hmm. Amazon, who I think have a really scalable way of getting things done at scale and retaining a certain amount of innovation and velocity, even as they become one of the world's most valuable companies. And there was a book published last year by a couple of early Amazon executives called Working Backwards. And again, I really highly recommend that one. So I guess that's kind of my reading list on culture. I have to admit, in terms of podcasts, I haven't found amazing ones, which is, I don't know if I haven't known the right place to look, but I find that the most interesting stuff has come from those books.
That's fantastic. And they are great ones. So thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for giving back to the Aussie startup ecosystem with this great advice. And I am looking forward to having a part 2 in the near future as you grow your team, your own organization. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me here, and looking forward to part 2 as well.